Today we are joined by Anushka Saxena. In this episode, we will be discussing India's evolving perspective of China.
There can only be one lion in the jungle or one tiger on the hill. And that's what the Chinese believe, and that's how they want the region to be shaped. No one is denying here that there is a power asymmetry between India and China. Mao Zedong did not believe in decentralizing power to various nodes. Indian border police had presented, where they said that India has lost access to many dozen patrolling points along the LAC.
Does this trade angle help solve this problem at all?
So I don't know if India's tax and tariff policy has been the friendliest. China's has been. Operation Sindoor has been a great example that's been set, that we are looking at one front, two actors. 81% of Pakistan's defense imports being Chinese.
Hello, viewers. Welcome to another episode of the Coffee House Experience. Today we are joined by Anushka Saxena, a staff research analyst at the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. Anushka's work primarily focuses on India-China relations, Chinese People's Liberation Army, China-Taiwan relations, and India's foreign policy on China, with a special lens on the developments in the Indo-Pacific region. She also curates the newsletter Eye on China and has contributed to leading think tanks and publications across the country. She has authored articles in multiple newspapers like the Hindu Indian Express and appeared also on public forums expressing her views. In this episode, we will be discussing India's evolving perspective of China with a focus on the recent developments. So Anushka, yes, welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having this on.
Thank you. So we can probably start maybe for our audience from a very basic level, that in terms of a broad overview, what do you think that understanding China from an Indian lens is important? And maybe at this very juncture, as we stand, why is it so important for us to, to understand about China from an Indian lens? If we can start with that.
Yeah, I guess that is the million-dollar question today, isn't it? That why is it that there is so much emphasis on researching China in India now, and increasingly in the last 5 to 6 years since the Galwan Valley clashes in 2020, right? And I guess the answer to that is very briefly that if we don't do a good job as Indians at decrypting and decoding what motivates this Asian giant, what are the domestic politics at play, what are the dynamics that shape policy making in this country, we might really never be able to grasp what a good counter measure or a good counter policy option may be. And why is it then that begs the question, why is it necessary to develop said counter policy or counter measure? It's because we're in a region that is dynamic and volatile, and and this is a Chinese thing, right? Chinese saying, pardon me, right? That there can only be one lion in the jungle or one tiger on the hill. And that's what the Chinese believe, and that's how they want the region to be shaped, as with Beijing or with China being the centermost or the foremost authority, the one with the most supremacy in the region. But that can't be the case, because there are actors like India that have viable and legitimate interests in the region. They have been shaping it historically, and they have important roles to play, right? India, for example, just in its neighborhood, I'm not even talking about the region, the Indo-Pacific region as a whole here, but just in its neighborhood, India has been first responder, net security provider, lender, sometimes even lender of last resort. And so these are things that build goodwill and trust. At the same time, India needs its neighborhood and the Indo-Pacific because it relies on this region for smooth trade, for fulfillment of its national security interests, for economic development, and of course, to feel like it has partners in the world, right? That is an important component of being a nation state in the current world order, partnerships. So why should then we agree to living in a regional dynamic where that can't be possible because we have to act on the whims of someone else? Now, no one is denying here that there is a power asymmetry between India and China, and comprehensively, right, in both economic and financial terms and in terms of military capabilities. But that doesn't negate the value India or ASEAN or any other country in the region holds. But that's not the perspective with which Beijing comes in into stuff like this. And so hence it becomes important for India to understand what makes this country tick, what are its economic challenges and prowesses, and is there something meritable that India can learn from it, and then perhaps even deploy it, take a leaf out of China's playbook, to counter narratives, uh, maneuvers of power, coercive activities, so on and so forth. So because of the realities of the neighborhood, I guess, and because of the power asymmetry, it becomes important that we focus on studying China, building comprehensive scholarship, and eventually having that scholarship act as a springboard to the making of policy.
Okay. So, I mean, I understand, like, even with information symmetry, it is like there's a big asymmetry between the two nations, but still, I mean, there cannot be like one lion in the jungle. I mean, it has to be a collaboration. Otherwise, it leads to, I mean, power indifferences. So, yeah. So, just on this context, I mean, can you help us just understand a bit about the Chinese political regime and how it has probably evolved? I mean, in terms of India or other countries, it has, for example, from Mao till Xi Jinping, there has been like some things which has not changed, and some aspects which have changed in terms of like loyalty to the Communist Party and their regime. Could you tell a bit about that? How that dynamics within China has been there, and what are the changes that has happened, or maybe what are the changes that have, or like if there are at all any changes that have happened, and if there are something which remained constant? So could you just
Yeah, I think that's a pretty interesting exercise to understand what China looks like from Mao to now. And of course, there are a lot of cultural aspects, things on the ground that have either changed or have evolved for the better or for the worse. So let's look at one of the things, right? Let's look at military prowess. There has been great evolution in what we know as the People's Liberation Army, from what it looked like under Mao Zedong to what it looks like under Xi Jinping today. Um, uh, there has always been conversation about reforming the Chinese military, but it is only under Xi Jinping since 2015 that the most wide sweeping set of reforms in the Chinese military have taken place, right? And if you look at what the PLA looked like when it was the Red Guards period during the Cultural Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward under Mao, to what it is today, the great degree of formality and a sense of the force being an official war fighting force, that has really enhanced. So under Mao, it was a bunch of personnel that had war fighting experience from the civil war within China before 1949, the war to establish the PRC, and of course the fight against Japanese imperialism before that. So there was a sense of camaraderie. It was not as commercial a force then. And then under Deng Xiaoping, there was increasing, I would say, centralization towards the center, and but you could see that now the shift is towards creating a force that is actually capable of fighting and winning wars based on doctrine. and based on ideological commitment to the party. And finally, with Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and subsequently Xi Jinping, we are seeing that leaders are becoming younger. And so they don't have that kind of experience of fighting side by side with their comrades in war, right? So now, how do they establish control over these personnel? They do it through promotions, so that their loyalists rise to the ranks, or they do it through anti-corruption purges, or purges to kind of crack down on political disloyalty or inefficiency or stuff like that. And I think that is the one thing that has become the most pronounced under Xi Jinping, even though these political and military purges have always been a feature of Chinese politics. But you're seeing now that the PLA is becoming a more commercial, doctrine-based force that is focused on winning wars, but also has a lot of instability to grapple with, because now efficiency has become a key motivator and key factor for assessment, unlike it used to be many, many years ago. Same with the economy, right? For many, many years, especially since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, its economy has been export oriented, which essentially means that most factors of economic growth or economic policy have been focused on how to export more and how to earn money from capitalizing on global markets and global market opportunities. That would mean that consumption internally in the country has been suppressed, because all that is being produced now has to go to the world, and it has to go to different markets, and we have to earn as much money as possible from that on that front. So suppression of consumption coinciding with the boost in investment, coinciding with subsidization of state-owned enterprises, right, which leads to more production, more manufacturing, cheaper production. All of that has largely focused on exports. But only recently, in the past 10 years, are we seeing that exports are slowly going down. And that is because of a host of changes in the global market conditions as well as internal economics in China. Right. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the stringent lockdowns that followed, income instability became a huge problem. So there wasn't much expenditure, and combine that with supply chain disruptions, right? So the world is increasingly protectionist now. Everyone wants to look inwards. There is the Trump phenomena. So export markets are shrinking. And so now China is facing a real economic crisis because of what was once its touted, crown jewel, right? That we are an export-led economy. Now their focus is on boosting consumption, because all of this overcapacity from subsidized production, there is no global market for that, for a host of reasons. And so now you want it to be consumed internally. So that's a huge change in economic policy. And finally, one point on regime and politics, right? I think, again, similar to what it was like in the military, under Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, perhaps the focus was more on camaraderie. But Mao Zedong did not believe in decentralizing power to various nodes. He was pretty much one of the strongest leaders of the CCP, perhaps the strongest leader of the CCP, with the most authority and power and control over things, which is why you saw these big blunders happen during his tenure, right? Especially with the Great Famine and the proletarian cultural revolution that went badly. So because of that kind of a power and its misuse, Deng Xiaoping had to initiate the concept of something known as collective leadership, which is where there are a few people who together come to a consensus on decision making on key issues pertaining to the economy. Now, Deng Xiaoping his tenure was not without challenges, but especially because his economic opening up policy was so revolutionary. There were people in the country that opposed, saying that this is highly capitalist, this is not a cornerstone of communism or Marxism, Leninism. But he still saw it through because he had support from other partners. And again, much to his success, it really led to economic growth for China. But since then, collective leadership has been dismantled under Xi Jinping, and now we no longer see that Xi Jinping, he might trust the advice of his aides and those close to him, but the model isn't such that it allows for great flexibility beyond what the Politburo or Xi Jinping have to say. So going from that model of flexibility, opening up, experimenting with innovation, to Hu Jintao, even whose policy and theory focused on harmonious coexistence, which revolved around scientific revolution and gave China some of its most innovative powerhouses across the country. Right, from going to that to innovation in a constrained environment, in an environment where the focus is to defeat the US or to become the foremost power in tech, that has really curbed freedoms, restricted collective leadership, but at the same time created kind of um, under pressure achievements or breakthroughs, which are most likely to be features of this tech war. That we're witnessing, that we're going to see under pressure innovations. Companies are going to be more aligned with state policy as much as they perhaps haven't been anytime in the past decades. But we're also going to see some non-linear breakthroughs happen, especially in China.
So broadly, you mostly spoke about the military angle of how it has evolved, the People's Liberation Army, and then you spoke about the trade angle as well on the export, how it has evolved when now it's like more consumption driven, internal consumption driven, and not really because of the latest issues with the US. And then you spoke about the regime, how it has changed and it has become one under pressure innovation to become the global tech giant sort of
Yeah.
with the other Western powers. So maybe just coming to the first point you mentioned about the PLA, right? About the People's Liberation. I mean, and I think you have spoken in various forums about this as well. You have researched about it. So in terms of the recent developments, say on the Galwan Valley, and also on the Ladakh and the Arunachal issue, what has been PLA's role in probably influencing that, or probably driving a narrative on this, that on these recent developments? Could you expand a bit on that side?
Yeah. Sure. Again, this is a question that's been haunting all of us. Why is it that Galwan Valley happened? Why is it that the skirmishes materialized to the point that they became deadly, right? Especially considering that for 4 decades before that, there were no deaths in any of the border skirmishes. Um, I guess there are many theories for it, but just to bring some of them together, I think the PLA is operating today in an environment where the world has become increasingly hostile to China. That is because of a bunch of things. Countries are finally realizing that China manipulated the markets all along, and it's created an economic dependency that's very hard to get out of. It's because as China's power has expanded over the years, it has become more militaristic and aggressive. It's now actually claiming aggressively that most of the South China Sea is its, and so it's getting into all of these near conflicts or under the threshold conflicts with the Philippines. It has become more aggressive on Taiwan, although Taiwan, again, if I have to talk about one thing that's remained consistent, is Taiwan, right? So reunification with Taiwan, that's always remained on the agenda of CCP leaders since before the inception of the PRC in 1949, right? But now under Xi Jinping, you're saying that the narrative has intensified to a point that people are actually speculating that 2027 is when China will invade, and 2030 is when China will invade. Somebody from the US military ecosystem said 2024 would be when China would invade. Of course, much of the speculation has to be taken with a grain of salt, but that's the kind of mistrust China has created for itself in the world today. And so internally, the PLA's doctrinal, practice related, operational and tactical concepts, all of them have become focused on one thing, which is that if you fight a war, you better win it, or else it's going to be a matter of huge shame, because China still continues to be deeply integrated with the economy, but it also has these red lines, right? Like Taiwan, like South China Sea, and like even territorial claims in the Indian territory, right? So if a military campaign is launched there and China faces both economic repercussions and failure to be able to be successful in those campaigns. It's a matter of huge embarrassment and loss. So that's what this is the kind of internal revolution that has come into the PLA based on the external situation at hand. And so in that sense, I think in the Indian context, the idea behind Galwan could potentially have been that there is some sense of a domestic insecurity because COVID-19 was out of control, and China would have wanted a win or a safe facing measure. So it thought maybe this issue at Galwan could be escalated and a victory could be claimed, so that the focus of the world shifts on that instead of how poorly the CCP is managing COVID-19 internally. Now that's one idea. Even for the 1962 war, this is a theory that's given, right? China says it was a result of Nehru's forward policy, but others also speculate that it could be because internally the cultural revolution was doing badly, and so they wanted to shift focus and save face on this external issue with India. And why India? It's because they realize that any other campaign is too tricky, especially in maritime theaters like Taiwan and the South China Sea. And India, there is obvious power asymmetry, and the PLA is a larger, much better force. So, a victory could be easier or could be more possible than anywhere else. And then you combine that with the build-up on the border that was already happening between April, May, and in early days of June, right? There were already military exercises of the PLA Western Theatre Command happening near the border. Permanent settlements were already coming up, and border access was already being restricted for Indian patrol. So, and then it could have been a heat of the moment thing that these skirmishes happened. But then there is also a sense of premeditation to that from the PLA side, because they came with clubs with nails on it, right? So you wouldn't come to a border talk with those clubs. So clearly they wanted a fight, and they got one, and the consequences of that are history. But yeah, I guess with the happening of Galwan, of course the Chinese haven't given an official reason for it. The whole emphasis of Indian policy has been on how to get disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction done, right? Disengagement already completed in October last year. There were 5 friction points that came up in January 2020, which were Galwan Valley, Pangong Tso Lake, North and South, and other areas, right? And so those 5 points witnessed disengagement of the troops from eyeball to eyeball contact in sometime in September 2022, I believe. But then after that, for 2 years, the focus of the core commander level talks between both sides was how to fix legacy issues as well. Because if you remember, sometime in 2023, I believe, there was a research paper that the Indian border police had presented, where they said that India has lost access to many dozen patrolling points along the LAC, which means that the Chinese settlements are actively restricting India from patrolling areas where troops used to be present. So that means that you need disengagement from even legacy areas like Depsang and Demcho, so that along those points India's patrols can continue. So and troop presence can be maintained. Otherwise, if troops go there and the PLA settlements are there, there's going to be another skirmish. So Depsang and Demchok were finally, the disengagement in those areas was finally agreed to in October last year. And since then, the focus has been on kickstarting the special representative talks and getting the LAC issue settled once and for all. Now, this has not been with ups. There have been trade issues since India has been trying to restrict imports and investments. China itself has acted on this and is now actively restricting its exports to India in fertilizers and rare earth magnets, of course. And then there have been other narrative contestations vis-a-vis the global south, vis-a-vis leadership of the region. So it's a complex dynamic, and the military angle, of course, is a big part of it, and not just in the continental domain, but in the maritime domain as well, in the Indian Ocean region. But yeah, I guess finally diplomatic conversations have started, and that's a good thing.
I think recently I heard that India also opened some of the hot springs, and I think in that region they plan to open a war memorial to perhaps I don't know, some sort of soft techniques to, you know, perhaps it's an part of de-escalation as well, and to reclaim some part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, maybe just shifting gears. So you spoke about another aspect of trade, right? And this is very interesting from the fact that we have been in midst of like two major wars, the Russia-Ukraine war, and also in the West Asia now, because of the recent escalations, and it has been for a year now. So, in terms of I think I read some of the research papers which were published, I think from Takshashila. So it talks about the middle corridor a lot, right? That earlier, because of the northern corridor being blocked, and because the Russia route being blocked, China is to establish trade routes with the European Union. It's been the middle corridor for trade has been in a lot of discussion. So, like from your view, what impact does it have if this middle corridor is being engaged, and how does it impact India? I mean, I understand India also needs to improve their own trade routes, like the North-South corridor, and like what impact does it have on India from a pure trade and connection with the EU perspective?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the middle corridor as a concept is it's still, I would say, in the ideation stages, because the idea is basically this, right? That China
To be
should
honest, I
be,
did not hear about it before. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, middle corridor, I didn't really. I just went to the map and saw there is some line drawn, but I never heard of it before as a concept.
Yeah, I think the idea is that because of the kind of uncertainties that trade through choke points in the maritime domain can cause, right? Bab el Mandeb, Strait of Hormuz, um, all of these choke points are in and around areas where conflict can erupt, or where restrictions can be posed because of the US-led West's trade and tariff measures. China wants, and of course, the Strait of Malacca, right? And Hu Jintao articulated this as the Malacca dilemma: how to stop depending on maritime choke points and still continue to trade. So, if China has to meet some of these insecurities surrounding trade through maritime routes, it has to be able to find a land corridor that can serve its purpose, right? So, the middle corridor would then become like an idea that you deploy operational rail networks or road networks in the land domain. You mobilize through Pakistan, Turkey, and other European economies, the Baltics, right, to be able to make trade to Europe accessible. And because Russia has been under consistent sanctions, and any exports coming out of Russia have been a huge matter, have been a matter of concern. These land routes even become even more vital for China to be able to access, so that they can circumvent not just the maritime trade routes, but also anything going from China via Russia to Europe. And this is precisely, I think, also why there is and this is in addition to the middle corridor, right? There is also the idea that China wants to shovel snow in the Arctic passageway north of Russia, where for so long ice has been frozen, but now glaciers are melting, and so there could be a viable trade route through the Arctic to Europe and to the West. So China is actively also making sure that it has its hands there. There are mobile radar and research stations China has already deployed in the Arctic area or to the north of Russia, precisely so that it could meet this dilemma of how to continue trade with Europe without being caught either on the Russia side of things or on the maritime side of things. And I think um often some people talk about what India's response should be. It should be the north south transport corridor. But I would say the INSTC has been under deliberation for a long time. Its problem is that it goes from Russia to Iran to India to Sri Lanka. So from north to south, its route is mired with actors that are unstable and cannot invest in and contribute to the project and make it viable. Russia, of course, is engaged in its war with Ukraine. Iran has its own issues going on now. And even with stuff like Chabahar port, we've seen with Iran that we've put in the investment, but projects have taken a long time to materialize. There is also the Pakistan angle can fervent difficulties in the materialization of the INSTC. So for all of these reasons, I think even though the transport corridor has been tested multiple times, it hasn't really materialized till date, which is why India has come up with the idea of IMEC, right? India, Middle East, Europe corridor. If India has to materialize a maritime plus land trade route through the Middle East to Europe, that could be a viable alternative. And there is some funding under discussion for that. But I think the dust hasn't settled on IMEC yet. And because, again, Israel is a factor there, and disturbances in the Middle East are a factor there, we don't know if we can trust that corridor to go through. But nonetheless, it's not in my opinion, viable to think about alternatives to the idea of the middle corridor, but rather finding ways to keep trade active, even if conflicts are ongoing and can be destabilizing. Now, for that, is IMEC the solution? I don't know. But we should not think about it in terms of counters, but rather in terms of India's interests and India's.
I had just one follow-up question. So, like in a global order, there was a time, I don't know if it still exists now, that India was supposed to be a China plus one strategy for many companies to invest because of, they wanted to have an alternative. So, does this trade angle help solve this problem at all? Like, if China is establishing itself, then because I see personally, many companies now are moving to Southeast Asia, like using, for example, Vietnam. They have been investing a lot, and many of the activities which were earlier outsourced to India are now being diverted there. Not sure how much India has been able to capitalize that plus one, like China plus one strategy. So
Yeah. Again, I think on China plus one, we do still continue to live in a world where India is supposed to be a viable alternative to China in the China plus one dynamic. So I guess that's a good thing. But there are a lot of factors why we haven't been able to leverage it and capitalize on it. And I think I'm afraid to say that most of them are internal, right? So there are many factors that have made China successive in the past decades as a viable destination for offshore activities of American or European companies, right? There are no restrictions to firstly, there is a market. So if these companies want to sell the products they have produced in China, and not all of it gets exported, they have some assurance that okay, it will be consumed within China. So China has had a market despite its consumption issues. There is often a fear in companies that India might not be able to provide a similar market, right? So for example, there was a news item recently that one of Foxconn's worries in India is and why it's not producing the MacBook in India is because there is a demand for iPhones, but there isn't as much of a demand for MacBooks. So why are they going to shift that production, right? Especially if export doesn't happen expansively, and not all MacBooks are consumed by the global market. Then one thing is that being able to sell within as well as abroad. The other thing is benefits, labor costs, tax rebates, so on and so forth, right? So I don't know if India's tax and tariff policy has been the friendliest. China's has been, and so companies have enjoyed a bunch of rebates. They've operated out of special economic zones, and what's that done for them is it has reduced labor costs, reduce the tax to be paid to the government, and it has also cleared off restrictions on working hours, which is why there's all of this rhetoric and meme about how Chinese labor is overworked. And obviously those costs then translate into cheaper products, which then get sold more in the world. in India, again, there has always been this tussle of labor rights, and not to comment on the good or bad of it. Of course, there are very valuable sentiments that are expressed, but companies don't are driven by profit motive, right? So that's another thing. And finally, there is the thing about local talent, local resources. Now again, another item is in the news is, oh, China has told Foxconn that we're going to withdraw 300 engineers from iPhone manufacturing facilities in Bangalore and Chennai, right? So that's a news item that's come out fairly recently, even though purportedly it's been happening for 2 months. So now, where will India get local talent, right? The time it goes from training to deployment is pretty long, especially when it comes to iPhone manufacturing or semiconductor assembly or anything of the sort. So, and frankly, this is one of the things that also leads to brain drain, right? If there is talent, they might want to work in greener pastures. So, that local training, local talent, and availability of resources, these are things that become a challenge, and then they demotivate companies. And if we look at, say, in terms of our semiconductor ambition, uh, the government politically has been very open with Taiwan, for example, right? That, oh, we want TSMC to come and invest in India. But why is TSMC going to come and invest in India, right? TSMC is Taiwan's crown jewel. It is the life and survival of that little island that is always threatened in the world. So they need a solid reason for to dilute the investments of TSMC, right? So India has to offer viable alternatives, some political assurances, but then we operate in a constrained environment where we face the China threat, so that doesn't materialize. So there's a bunch of those internal economic policy and geopolitical factors that are hindering India right now. And if you talk to some Taiwanese or Chinese engineers or talent, they often also say that we go to Vietnam or Indonesia or Malaysia because there are cultural similarities, and that makes them feel more comfortable, and it helps them work it out. So that is one added thing that may not necessarily work for India in this case, but maybe perhaps India-US proximity in the recent years could open up some opportunities for Indian talent.
You spoke about the semiconductor part, right? So I think this is one key topic along with the EV wave, which is currently there, right? So even with all renewable energy, EV, I mean, India has launched a lot of initiatives, like FAME initiative and all these things for the adoption of EV, but still we see China is one of the leaders in EV adoption production. Name BYD, it's now flooding everywhere, giving tough competition. Not only competition, I think it's beating Tesla as well in many aspects. So so this leads to an important fact that China controls critical supply chains related to the rare earth materials, right? They have this, I mean, leverage of the rare earth materials like lithium and etc. So in terms of, and they control, I believe, some of the mineral supply chains as well. I think they have been, I was reading, I think, the survey as well that they were probably using it, I mean, for investing a lot in mining activities as well. So my question was that where does India stand here? I mean, can India, being a neighbor, leverage this, or is it something? I mean, what could be India's strategy in this case to counter this dominance? Because it is something which is for the future, right? I mean,
yeah. Thanks for that. So I think, and this is a question that we've been grappling with at Takshashila as well, and we talk a lot about this, right? Do we need to counter this dominance, or should we adopt the policy of, if you can't beat them, join them? Because there is nothing wrong with a little cooperative competition or competitive cooperation, right? Because if you look at, say, EVs, for example, in the next many years, it is practically impossible for anyone to be able to come up with the kind of cost advantage China has gained in EV production, lithium mining, and not just mining, right? Processing, which is the key bit of for rare earth materials and stuff like this, and lithium, of course. So that dominance can't be beaten overnight. It will require many years of concerted effort, coexisting alongside the continuing hostility against China. So only when the overcapacity of EV production in China will become such a problem that China stops investing in this, and that coincides with India's continued effort to build a processing and manufacturing base, can then India think about beating that dominance. But till such a time as that happens, China produces the most EVs in the world. BYD, like you rightly pointed out, has become the biggest player in all of this. And there is genuine demand internally as well to be able to fill at least some of the export gap in the world. Of course, with Chinese EVs, there are concerns of technological manipulation, the EU, and subsidies, of course. So the EU has launched anti-subsidy investigations, which is why Chinese exports of EVs to the EU are restricted. But still, you see consumers in Europe and in the US buying Chinese EVs just with that little extra cost because there is so much tariff. From the Indian perspective, it is okay to think about continuing to import Chinese EVs, or at least because it will be very difficult in this time of a contentious relationship to convince China that, look, invest in EV production in India. And BYD did try to do that in 2023, right? In that JV with Migha, but that didn't materialize because the Indian government said no, right? Because at that time our focus was on countering China economically and militarily. So now, because China realizes the kind of leverage that it has in this rare earth and so on and so forth, right? So the question is, can India still not continue to build its domestic EV ecosystem while also importing Chinese EVs? Because if there is demand today, why not import the EVs and sell them? And the government gets the cut of the share as it does on consumer products or automobiles. And slowly, China has reverse engineered tech. If India has the talent, India can reverse engineer some of. But till the time it builds that domestic ecosystem, I don't see what the harm is in importing the EVs. And as for, I think, again, lithium and rare earths, the question is if we can invest in processing. Again, I know there is government investment in processing capabilities, but what China has done over the years is it has gone abroad, bought lithium reserves in Bolivia, for example, and now it's importing that lithium and processing it domestically. Even Australia, having so much REE reserve, somewhere or the other falls short of processing, which is why China may not even have the biggest reserves of rare earths. But because its processing is so massive, processing capabilities are so massive, the real product that goes into production comes out of and is used in China. And even India has reserves of some REEs, lithium, which was found in J&K, I believe, right, in Ladakh. But unless we have those processing capabilities, again, that dominance is hard to beat. So till such a time, can we find ways to collaborate in green technology, in e-waste recycling? Can we buy lithium batteries from China, if not EVs? So these are things that you have to think about, because you have to give market access to the Chinese to be able to convince them that this is investment that you need to make in India. And once that happens, investment becomes a two-way street, right? It becomes mutual interdependence as opposed to one-sided dependence. So once that investment is in the country, you can do whatever you want with it, right? You can conduct ED raids whenever you feel like something's wrong going on, or if there are tensions in India-China relations, you can use those investments to your advantage. But for that, you have to allow it to come in.
So, I mean, it's like find the gaps, like what are the gaps which exist, and then probably collaborate on those and utilize your strength as a way forward. Because then only the ultimate value comes, rather than trying to completely counter not very good. So, okay, maybe if just to move forward, I just wanted to know one angle on this is So right now there is an maybe just to move to a completely different topic. So recently in the Operation Sindhu, right, which happened with India, Pakistan, there has been, like, I want to highlight two angles. One is there has been a lot of information, or say misinformation. It's kind of an information warfare. I don't know what is the term. So there has been a lot of misinformation going around also in the mainstream media related to this aspect. And also one critical, I've heard many interviews and all, and one critical thing that has struck my mind is also the use of Chinese military by Pakistan. For example, their J-10 jets, which they have used in this operation. So just wanted to understand, could you broadly tell about these two aspects? One is the misinformation warfare, maybe both by China, Pakistan, and also by India to some extent, and then also on the military angle, that how critical it is in terms of Indian foreign policy or Indian military strategy. So could you just expand a bit on that?
Yeah. Yeah, so if I may, I'll take the second question first, right, which is about the collusion between China and Pakistan's military and the implications for Indian doctrine. The short answer is that it's happening. It's out there. Operation Sindoor has been a great example that's been set, that we are looking at one front, two actors, both on the Pakistani side on the Western front and on the Eastern front with China. Now we don't know how Pakistan can aid China. Maybe it can, but and there are some potential answers to that, but that will be speculative, so I won't get into that. But at least on the Pakistani front, we know that it's one front, two actors. Now, if we look at operation, let's look at the trends first and the numbers. So SIPRI it does an excellent arms transfer report for a 5-year period, and in the past 5 years, between 2020 to 2024 end, we've seen 81% of Pakistan's defense imports being Chinese. So that's huge. That is absolutely huge, because Pakistan is completely dependent now on Chinese defense components, weapon systems, etc., for its own military force and military modernization, right? And from the Chinese perspective, this number is 63%. So 63% of China's defense exports to the world are in fact concentrated in Pakistan. So then you can make the case that there is a great degree of interdependence between the military industrial complexes of the two. Now, if you put it in Operation Sindhu's concept, now we know it's not like the Indian military apparatus doesn't know that for many years now, China and Pakistan have been conducting joint exercises. There has been jointness that is being practiced, at least, even if it's not materialized in terms of doctrine, in terms of training of troops and personnel, command, hierarchy, and of course weapon systems and intelligence sharing. Like, so these are all multiple components that come together, and if they materialize, one can say that, okay, these two armed forces are joint and they're interoperable. Now, I won't say that's the case, but just in weapon systems trade, we are seeing that Pakistan is actively deploying Chinese tech to be able to formalize its own national security gains. So in Operation Sindoor, what we saw was that there was a Chinese jet, the J-10C export variant, that used a Chinese missile, which is the PL-15, again the export variant, and was supported by Chinese ground-to-air systems or air defense systems like the HQ-9B and the HQ-16 Pakistan, which together created a made in China ecosystem, or a made in China arsenal, that then created challenges for India, right? So of course, Pakistan has a solid air force, no denying that, but India was, I would say, to the best of my knowledge, based on open source, caught caught blindsided, and that is perhaps why there was some downing of jets. We don't know the exact numbers, but we know that there were losses, and Chinese weapon systems and arsenal had a huge role to play in that. In addition, there is verifiable speculation that China helped Pakistan with intelligence on Indian positions. So Pakistan may not have known of India's forward positions or the deployment of its air defense systems across the border, but there was some degree of collusion in radar and signals intelligence sharing, in sharing of electronic intelligence, communications, so on and so forth, and through a bunch of technology exchange of technological infrastructure, right? And Chinese radars are right there; they're very close by to the Pakistani border. So because of this, both the use of Chinese weapon systems and some degree of collusion in the intelligence sharing space, we know that Pakistan was able to gain some degree of an advantage, and India had to counter not just Pakistan but also China. And of course there was support from Turkey, which is why India-Turkey relations haven't also been doing the best. So there is very obvious implication for the Indian military here, that now you're preparing for multiple actors which bring different skill sets to the table. But as an armed force, we have to be integrated in our response. So we need information and cyber superiority. We need superiority in the air, and we need to have a strong naval component that can coordinate with the air, the land, and the information aspects if at all the attack comes to sea, right? So for this, I think the most vital step going forward is a surge in defense spending. Now that we know that the military challenge is on our doorstep, right, and actively advancing, we need to go. In 2012, the military spending was 17 to 18% of government expenditure. Today, it's 12%. But it's so ironic because now the threat is more exacerbated. Same with defense spending as a percentage of GDP, right? We have gone from slightly above 2% to 1.9% in the past 2 financial years. But why? But what will explain this, right? So we need a surge at least of a 2.5 to 3%, so that a lot of the money can go from being concentrated on pensions and salaries to capital outlay. And capital outlay is an important part of the budget because that is what is spent on the services and on the cyber and the space aspects for the acquisition of weapon systems and for the training of officers in modern needs for war fighting. And it's drones and frigates and submarines, all of this, right? All of this comes from the capital outlay. So for that, you need to spend more money on defense. And finally, on the question of information warfare and misinformation.
Just before you answer my second question, so recently after Operation Sindoor, we saw some initiatives, our defense minister on the BrahMos missile and their export, right? Like, is it a conscious attempt in that angle to at least give a visual of the fact that there will be more initiatives in defense, more investments in defense, also in the Make in India to make India self-reliant on defense? Do you see in that, and as you said on the capital outlay, do you see it as an attempt in that direction, or is it just a visual?
Yeah, no, I think with BrahMos, I think the case for Make in India and self-reliance in defense is slightly, it's adjacent, it's tangential to the BrahMos thing, but I think they're slightly separate in the sense that the BrahMos missile export initiative is about commercializing Indian defense capabilities in the external market. So that is about having an experience of producing something, a major arm like missile or a missile system. For this, we've had Russia's help. And so this joint missile produced by India and Russia, BrahMos, can be a testament to India's defense production capabilities and commercialization capabilities abroad. So we've already sold the BrahMos missile to the Philippines. There are some deals in the making with Vietnam. And we are targeting some other countries in Africa and Latin America, although I don't know if that has materialized, right? So that is definitely a show of force when it comes to the success of Make in India in defense, but it may not necessarily be about um, modernization of the armed forces themselves. On that front, I think that bit of Make in India that seeks to replace defense imports with self-reliant products, with Indian made products, is more important. So we have the Shrijan Defense Program, under which we have 5,012 components, all defense related components, from screws to optical cameras to other radars and other things. These 512 products are listed under 5 positive indigenization lists, or PILs. And the goal is that sometime between 2025, 2028, and then 2030, all of these 5,000 plus components have to now be made in India, and the import dependence that we have in them has to be done away with. Of course, like many other things in the bureaucratic ecosystem of India, the deadlines for indigenization have been delayed massively. So if you look at the second positive indigenization list, it had some 100 plus components, and only some 20 of that have been indigenized. And the deadline for that was 2024-25. So I don't think the remaining 80 can be indigenized by the time we reach the end of 2025, right? So there are delays on that front. And I think some of the money from the surge in defense spending for capital outlay could go to this indigenization, especially if our imports come from unstable actors like Russia and China. But if our imports come from countries like Switzerland, which helps us import a lot of military gear, for example, winter gear, then I don't see why we have to indigenize or become self-reliant in that, right? Because in the face of limited resources, we have to make sure that money only goes to things that really require it, and blatant indigenization of everything doesn't really work out, right? And that's why, and this is also important because we have to foster partnerships in defense, right? If we have to reduce dependence on Russia, again, can't be done overnight. So we need to seek alternatives in Israel, France, the US, to be able to counter both Pakistan and China.
Okay. And this, then my second part was on the misinformation. So maybe you can also, now that I think that you can also answer, because I was curious to know about this in the frame of COVID-19 as well, because during that time also we were hearing a lot of stories, but till date we don't know whether what was the misinformation from either from China. So yeah, I mean in general, because misinformation or fact checking has been, I mean it has been rampant in Indian media as well as in Pakistan as well as in China. So in general, could you just tell a bit about?
Yeah. So in terms of, okay, if we take the case of COVID-19, so there is some misinformation that is just unhealthy, right? Which is thal pito and drink hydrochloric acid and all of that, right? Which is which obviously doesn't have a geopolitical motivator, but it's also not harmless. So that requires a different kind of fact checking, medical fact checking. Then there is misinformation about how China has managed the COVID-19 pandemic really well, how lockdowns haven't led to any loss of livelihoods, how income is still stable, so on and so forth, right? Now, that is misinformation that creates challenges for the Chinese people and for the world economy. And we've seen a lot of it happen during COVID-19. In fact, the head of the Indo-Pacific Studies Program at Takshashila, Manoj Kewalramani, has written a book on this, on how China managed the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the key insight there is that you've seen a great degree of censorship in the country. There is already a great firewall that protects content from going out in the world or even being displayed to the Chinese population. But you saw censors were running on overtime, and they were amplified in numbers, and anything pertaining to how the state handled the COVID-19 pandemic was being hidden. So there was some speculative news about the death of certain doctors that talked about how when it was discovered in December 2019 that how this could be a pandemic, and then that doctor was found dead later. There is something called Wuhan Diaries, another book by Chinese citizen that talks about the mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic by China. And so all of this is misinformation that was really harmful. And the WHO told us in the early the US told us that the WHO should have received information from China on the genetic sequence earlier, although China has defended it, and it said that as soon as we found it, we shared it with the WHO. But I think in terms of COVID-19, I think that's pretty much what the issue is. And if we have to question how the Wuhan virus came about, right, and the information surrounding, oh, it was leaked from a lab, and it was being produced in a lab, for that I would recommend the viewers to refer to this excellent US Congress report that has come out last year or sometime earlier this year, I believe. And that report talks about how there was something known as gain of function research going on in a laboratory in Wuhan. Gain of function research experiments with viruses, but synthetically adds functions to the viral body to assess how the virus would then react and how the virus would then mutate. And that research has obvious implications for viral infections going forward in the future, right? So if we can add functionalities to a viral vector or subtract functionalities, so gain of function and loss of function, you can test how the virus will mutate and how it will impact humans. So it has been categorically proven that in the Wuhan lab that is suspected to have leaked the virus, there was gain of function going on, and there were US companies involved in funding that gain of function research, hence the US Congress report, right? So subsequently, I think that funding stopped when Anthony Fauci was head of CDC, Centers for Disease Control. But it is very much possible that a lab leak indeed happened, because the COVID-19 virus was very different from the viral vectors of the COVID family that we have found, or SARS-CoV family that we have found previously. And on misinformation in general, I think especially with the China-Pak issue and Ops Sindoor, we've absolutely just seen China blatantly parroting Pakistani narratives. There is no doubt now that Pakistan is going to be supported by China, not just militarily and economically, but also in terms of rhetoric. And that's where it really becomes important for India to counter Chinese narratives, because the world is very very short-sighted, right? They have very little memory of things that happen. So you have to consistently remind them that Pakistan is a terror sponsor. China is India's main threat. They're both manipulators. They're both malactors. So if China and Pakistan collectively manage to outpace India in the narrative and the information space, then it will become very difficult for India to defend actions like targeting terror outfits, targeting military facilities in Pakistan, right? Because then everyone in the world is going to ask India to de-escalate. And then that becomes an issue. So you have to be able to defend your actions with solid narrative. And so for that, you have to keep reminding the world. And Shashi Tharoor did that, right? He led a delegation to countries across the world. Now, you can debate the merits of that, but the fact is that with the China-Pak thing, or with any of the other issues, and the contentious relationship with both Pakistan and China, we're going to see them collude in the information space. And for that, India not only needs a solid narrative campaign, it also needs partners of its own.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some extent they were also successful in creating the narrative, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think India had to send all these delegations across the world to probably counter that narrative and bring the terrorism angle, which was somehow lost, I feel. Entire narrative even. Yeah. Okay. Maybe, I had one question. While I was just going through the different sites of Takshashila, I found that there was that China also invests something like a lot of their money as well as their resources in the cultural exchange, in media, and also probably, I don't know, promotion is the right word, but it's like highlighting that they have an ancient civilization, then the Buddhism angle. So, in terms of to exercise the soft power, to influence and generate a narrative. So, do you think that has somehow worked for them as well, along with all the other aspects of military, trade, their administration? That has also been an enabler in their dictating the global narrative.
Yeah, I think so. Soft power is a tricky concept, right? You can't really say if it had an if it was soft power tools that had an impact on the relations or not. So, for example, is Cambodia a Chinese friend because they have shared ties in Buddhism, or is it because Cambodia is deathly afraid of what of Chinese aggression? So you can question the validity of soft power at some times, but that doesn't negate the fact that yes, there is concerted Chinese investment in shaping narratives through cultural aspects. And that is precisely what we're also seeing with the whole Tibet issue and the issue of the Dalai Lama's succession,
Right.
right? The Chinese are claiming, and they love to claim this, right? We're an ancient civilization, and everything we ever do has historical precedents. So, if we are claiming islands in the South China Sea, it's because in 2000 BC, one of our explorers went to the South China Sea and started naming places there and calling it the Nansha Islands and the sea, right? So, or the Huangyan Dao. So they'll say that because we have these historical proofs, because we're such an ancient civilization, this area belongs to us, or we only have authority on this issue. Same with the issue of Tibetan Buddhism, right? Unfortunately, in their quest for power and autonomy over Tibet, which was a borderland area, China exacerbated its control over the institutions of Tibetan Buddhism, monasteries, and that led the 14th Dalai Lama to flee to Dharamshala. So now when China goes into the world and says, look, we are the home of Tibetan Buddhism and we have ancient and cultural traditions to support this claim, actually that it creates a cognitive dissonance because their actions have been coercive. So they might have been the birthplace of Tibetan Buddhism, or if you can say that, after control over Tibet, China can say that yes, okay, we are where Tibetan Buddhism was born, because historically Tibet was not a part of China, right? But after control, yeah, you can say that you are the birthplace of Tibetan Buddhism. But when countries like Cambodia or other countries in the world that follow Tibetan Buddhism, like Mongolia, see that all of this control has been a result of coercion, there will be only two policy responses. Either you oppose it vehemently, or the narrative that you're an ancient civilization and a cultural power, or you fall in line. So Mongolia has fallen in line to a great degree, Cambodia has fallen in line. But other countries where there are Tibetan Buddhism followers, like Japan, um, because of the otherwise contentious relationship with China as well, or India, there has been not a lot of support for the Chinese narrative on culture and cultural supremacy, right? So China obviously deploys some of this, and there's also debate around Confucius institutes, right? Whenever they train someone in countries abroad, they try to cynicize and whitewash the trainees to think more favorably of China. But that is what narratives and soft power do, right? If there was an Indian institute somewhere abroad teaching Kathak or any other Indian classical dance form, there would be narratives and stories about Ramayana or Mahabharat, which will be expressed through dance, and then people will favorably think of those texts and the Indian culture. So, I guess that is not alone enough. The idea of Confucian institutes and training in Chinese culture, that's not alone enough to say that China manipulates and whitewashes. But then you see evidence of that in how countries may accept Chinese authority over these cultural issues. And that's when you can make the claim that yes, there has been some degree of success in China's soft power and narrative control.
It's not really a soft war, it's more of a soft war as a disguise. I mean,
Correct.
soft war as a disguise and then exercising their control over. Yeah. Yes, the
Totally.
Dalai Lama incident, yeah, I think you also wrote an article about it, right? Yeah. Yes, yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. the very recent incident.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe before we wrap up, my final question is to sum up the entire discussion that if you were to, I mean, if I were to ask you that through an Indian lens, what maybe your top two or top three biggest misunderstandings about of in like through India for China and also vice versa, what do you think are top three misunderstandings or something which India perceives differently or China perceives differently? Just for our audience to broadly sum up.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'll do my best to manage three on both sides, but
I mean, yes. Just,
please pardon me.
yeah.
But so I think the first misunderstanding on the Indian side that it may not be true across the board, but is definitely felt in some corners, is that China is a friend because both of us are ancient civilizations. I think the structural reality today is very different. This is a time when geopolitical considerations and geoeconomic leverage has far superseded ideas of mutual development, mutual growth, and the time when Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was a reality. We've come a long way from that time. So, for any quarters that invest in the belief that India and China can be friends because they have risen together since ancient times, they will have to temper their expectations in today's world. So, I guess that would be one thing. The other misunderstanding on the fag end would be that India and China do not have any possibilities of cooperation because of these structural economic and political realities, right? And to that, I would say that is the kind of thinking that would restrict Indian economic growth and India's options in the world, right? Because um, if for example you have to invite Apple as a manufacturer in India, Apple is not going to come as Apple. It's going to have these 10 different suppliers for different components, many of whom will have headquarters in China. So it's going to bring an ecosystem into India if it has to really manufacture for both consumption and export. So that's when you will have to be open to Chinese investments and Chinese firms and Chinese talent coming into the country, and that will account for some degree of cooperation, right? So I don't think it's possible to live, and this is something the Economic Survey of India of 2024 also agreed to, that for our own growth we're going to need to have some degree of integration with supply chains that go through or come out of China. So we have to also temper our expectations of just how much economic pain we can inflict on them, because they can inflict far more on us than we can on them. And maybe a third misconception would be that because China is such a big power, there is nothing we can do about it. So maybe I'm biased because I want to be optimistic as a person, but no, there are things that we can do about this, but that it will require a fundamental rethink and consistency in internal economic and military policy. Like I said, you have to take surge spending seriously in defense. You have to take some degree of economic openness seriously, and for that, some other colleagues of mine at Takshashila have proposed that we take a gradual and phased approach to reducing and removing tariffs so that we become a viable alternative, not just for investments but also for exports, because tariffs have been a huge problem for us. So that internal rethink, once it materializes, it could really mean that we can do something about China. So this would also be a misconception that there's nothing we can do. If we can overcome some of these barriers to thought and action, we really can. Um, and on the Chinese side, I would say one misconception, and it's always hilarious to me, is just stereotypical, right? For them, um, India is this backward economy with bunch of poverty, with no real functioning rail and road networks, and so this all of this is just old now. And even in the aftermath of Operation Sindoor and some deliberation around the downing of jets, there was a pretty racist video that came out in Chinese media platforms showing how Indians are these dark-skinned people and they're crying over how jets have been downed, right? And they don't have the tech, they are so backward. So all of these things, the Chinese need to retire it, at least if they have to present that they are a sophisticated society and media ecosystem. And yeah, I guess that's one misconception that I've often seen in the Chinese society, for whatever historic reasons. But I think India has risen above a lot of these things, and as even our military spokespersons have said across the press briefings in Operation Sindoor, losses in war happen, but we're working towards being a sophisticated economic and military ecosystem. So China should look past all of that to the actual potential that there exists for mutual development and cooperation. Oh, yeah. And I think the big one, and I'll stop at two for China, but I think the big misconception in the Chinese ecosystem is that India is the pawn of the US. And I think this primarily also has become so popular in elite opinion and government thinking as an idea, is because China's world is very tinted with the lens of with the colors of its competition with the US, right? So everything it sees through the perspective of, is this US friendly or US competitive or something of the sort, right? So if India and US are expanding their proximity, they're expanding domains of partnership, both in military and tech, and we've seen this happen in the past few years rather extensively, right? For that, that means to China that India is a pawn of the US, and India is beyond hope and it's being manipulated by the West, right? But that's not the case. I think in India, we still continue to pride on the idea of strategic autonomy. We more often than not have the power to act in our interests instead of being in compliance with either the West or China and Russia. And so I think that the nuance of Indian foreign policy is something that China should respect. And that's all I have to say about that.
No, thank you. It was very well summed up, and yeah, overall, yeah, I mean, it was a very good discussion. So, and it was a real delight to talk to you because it was spanning across, I mean, subjects and our extensive research. I mean, that is, I hope it's very useful and insightful for the audience as well. But yeah, it was very insightful talking. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Souvik, and thank you to your viewers as well. I hope too it's useful to them. So yeah.
And all the best for your future endeavors. And yeah.
You too. Thank you.